Our friends over in Victoria are starting to move towards making mandatory vaccinations compulsory for people in most industries. So most workers in Victoria are going to have to be vaccinated against COVID-19. It's coming into effect, obviously, here for frontline health workers. And with this no jab, no pay approach being discussed at National Cabinet, what does it all mean for employers? They're going to become so confused about whether or not it's going to have to be introduced into their workplace or not. On the line is Emma Dawson, Employsure business partner. Emma, good afternoon.
Afternoon. Thanks for having me.
Pleasure. I bet your phone's been ringing off the hook.
Yeah, it's definitely been very busy with the introduction of all the mandatory vaccinations.
So how does a business try and ascertain whether or not it's going to be compulsory for them? Or does it really just come down to that small business and their own decisions?
What it will come down to is if the state or territory enforces any laws or public health orders in which specific industries need to comply with.
So you have to refer back to your various states in the end. This won't be a national agreement, Emma.
At current, it's not a national agreement and there's no national legislation in place. Essentially, every state is going to be slightly different, but each state will have its own requirements in regards to specific laws or public health orders in which are implemented.
So Victoria's made a bigger move than most states at the moment. They're saying every authorised worker, so that includes people like lawyers, people of faith, personal trainers and the like, they have to have their first dose of the COVID vaccine within 2 weeks from today if they want to continue working. Do you expect something similar, Emma, will be enforced in other states and territories around the country?
It's difficult to predict at the moment, but potentially we could see similar approaches being enforced across different states. What it will really come down to is there's three criteria in which an employer might have the ability to require an employee to be vaccinated. Mm-hmm. The first is if there's a state or territory law or public health order that's put into place.
Yep.
The second is if an employer has an employment contract with an employee, or if there's an enterprise agreement or other registered agreement that requires the employee to get vaccinated. And thirdly is if there is a reasonable and lawful direction for an employer to require that employee to get vaccinated. And that will very much depend on the business, so taking into account the employee's circumstances, effectiveness of other measures, and if the employee has any genuine reason to refuse, such as like a valid medical reason.
Employers starting to put this into new contracts for staff that they might hire. There might be a term and condition of part of your employment that you need to be vaccinated against COVID-19, yet some of your co-workers can't be backdated or their employment contracts changed.
We could see that. It once again really comes down to the industry and the nature of the employee's role. Employers could be looking to make vaccinations a condition of employment, but it will come down to if there's a legal requirement, if it's an inherent requirement of that employee's role. So we've seen that with the healthcare industry, or if based on the nature of their role, there's a risk to the health and safety of the worker or the others if they were not to be vaccinated. That
criteria you just outlined in terms of state law employment contracts and a reasonable direction, there must be still a little bit of wriggle room without a bit of ambiguity. So are employers worried about the ramifications of all of this, Emma?
Yeah, there could be, some ambiguity in respects to that, but that's why it's really important that employers need to be consulting with their workers regarding these changes, and they ultimately need to be doing a risk assessment. If there's not a legal requirement under state or territory law for an employer to direct an employee to be vaccinated, they need to do a risk assessment to determine the risk of transmission of COVID, and if it's going to be if it's a high risk, then it would be deemed lawful and reasonable to direct that employee to be vaccinated.
I assume as well, though, some staff would be equally worried about losing their job as much as employers would be if they refuse, ultimately, their best workers to go and get the jab.
It is a concern, and there is a lot of different factors that we do need to take into consideration. If an employee is refusing to get vaccinated, the first thing an employer needs to be doing is consulting with that employee to find out why they're refusing. Is it due to personal preference? Is it due to a medical reason, religious belief, or a political belief? And then based on that reason, we'll determine the approach in which the employer needs to take. If it's based on a protected attribute, we would look at, is there any legal exemptions in place for that? If there's no legal exemptions, potentially the employer might need to consider a capabilities process. If it's a case of it's just personal preference, but say they're in the healthcare industry and there is a mandatory legal requirement for them to be vaccinated to work in that job, the case might be that an employer needs to do a show cause meeting with that employee to state that it is an inherent requirement of your role based on the state regulations in place, and by being unvaccinated, they're not able to fulfill the inherent requirements of that role.
Les writes on the text line, will employers be held accountable if there are vaccine injuries?
It's a difficult one at the moment. If there is any vaccination side effects, I think it's something that there does definitely need to be some further clarity on in respects to legislation and, what I guess long-term implications will mean if there is any kind of side effects to the vaccine and what the business's responsibility and obligations are. I think because it is such new territory, we do need some further clarity. Thanks
for your time, Emma. Have a good weekend.
Thank you. You too.
Employsure business partner Emma Dawson, 133 882. It's going to be an interesting field to navigate, but Victoria moving the needle first here. So among the professions listed as authorised workers, even include professional athletes, state and federal MPs, actors, journalists, lawyers, faith leaders and personal trainers. So millions of Victorians will be required to have their first shot, if not already, by the middle of October if they want to return to work.